Hey friends, tonight we begin a journey into the heart of one of the strangest, most beautiful, and most tangled stories from ancient Greece. It's a story about a love that began with jealousy, continued with deception, and somehow, quite unexpectedly, transformed into eternity. So before you get comfortable with your tea or settle under the covers, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy these cozy nightly legends. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how all of us, from different corners of the world, can travel together into these ancient myths just before falling asleep. And now, take a deep breath, maybe dim the bright lights, and perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into the story of a girl so beautiful she managed to annoy the goddess of beauty herself. Book I, a princess of the sunlit court. Before the world knew its name as a synonym for tragedy, the city of Troy was a song. It was a melody of white stone and golden sunlight. Its great walls so tall and strong, it was said they had been built by the gods themselves. The city stood proudly on the plains by the sea, a jewel of civilization, its gates open to trade, and its temples rich with the offerings of a prosperous and devout people. The river Scamander flowed nearby, its waters a lifeline, and the fields around the city were always fertile. This was Ilium, the city of the sun, a kingdom at the very peak of its glory, blissfully unaware of the long dark shadow that was beginning to stretch towards its unbreachable walls. In the heart of this radiant city, in the royal palace of King Priam, lived his many children, and among them none were more intriguing than the twins, Cassandra and Helenus. They were a study in contrasts. Helenus was thoughtful and calm, his presence reassuring. Cassandra was aflame, bright, intense, and possessing a strange, otherworldly sensitivity that set her apart. From a young age, she seemed to exist on a different plane than those around her. While other children played games in the courtyard, she would be found in the quiet corners of the temple gardens, her head tilted as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. She was beautiful, with the dark, striking beauty of the Trojan royal line, but it was her eyes that held people captive. They were the color of a stormy sea, and they seemed to see more than just what was in front of them. They saw the patterns in the flight of birds, the hidden meanings in the crackle of a fire, the faint, shimmering auras that clung to people and places. She had a natural, intuitive connection to the divine, a raw sensitivity that made the world feel both intensely beautiful and deeply, inexplicably sad to her. Her family loved her, but they did not always understand her. Her father, the wise King Priam, saw her devotion and was proud. Her mother, Queen Hecuba, worried about her daughter's fragile, overly perceptive nature. Her many brothers, led by the noble Hector, treated her with a gentle, protective affection, viewing her as a creature of spirit and air, not quite of their solid earthly world. Her closest bond was with her twin, Helenus. They shared a quiet, unspoken understanding. Legend said that as children, they had fallen asleep in the temple of Apollo, and the sacred temple serpents had come and licked their ears, cleansing their senses and opening them to the voice of the divine. Whether by a serpent's touch or a gift of birth, they both felt the currents of the unseen world. But while Helenus's visions were often clearer, more logical, like riddles that could be solved, Cassandra's came in overwhelming, sensory waves, the scent of burning wood when there was no fire, the taste of salt on a wind blowing from a calm sea, a sudden piercing feeling of grief for a sorrow that had not yet happened. In these early days, her gift was not yet a curse. It was simply a part of who she was. She was the strange, beautiful princess who could predict a coming storm by the color of the sky, or know which ewe would bear twins. Her premonitions were small, provincial things, and when they came true, the court would smile with fond amusement, at the uncanny wisdom of their princess. She was happy. The love of her family was a warm cloak, and the solid walls of her city were the edges of her known safe world. She spent her days serving in the great temple of Apollo, the god she felt most connected to, the god of light, music, and clarity. She felt that her life's purpose was to be a clear vessel, a pure conduit for the divine truths he represented. But sometimes, even in the heart of her sunlit, perfect city, a fleeting shadow would cross her soul. She would be looking at the face of her beloved brother Hector, and for a split second see his image overlaid with blood and dust. Or she would hear the joyous laughter of her people in the marketplace and feel it curdle into a scream. These visions were gone as quickly as they came, leaving behind only a faint cold dread that she would quickly push away. They were just daydreams, she told herself, meaningless flickers in a world of solid, unchanging peace. She was a princess of the sun, and she could not yet comprehend that her destiny was to become a prophetess of the dark. Book 2, The Whispers of a God. Cassandra's devotion to Apollo was the central pillar of her young life. While others prayed for tangible boons, a good harvest, a safe voyage, a healthy child, Cassandra prayed for clarity. She would spend long, silent hours in his great temple, a magnificent structure of white marble that seemed to hold the very light of the sun within its walls. She did not ask for favors, she sought communion. She traced the patterns on the mosaic floors, her mind trying to comprehend the divine order of the cosmos, the perfect logical beauty that Apollo represented. She saw him not just as a patron of her city, but as the principle of truth itself, a truth she yearned to understand with every fiber of her being. Such purity of worship does not go unnoticed in the heavens. On Olympus, Apollo, the most brilliant and perhaps the most arrogant of all the gods, began to feel her prayers. Amidst the endless, chaotic chorus of mortal pleas for help and praise, her devotion was a single, pure, perfectly pitched note. It was a clear, quiet signal in a universe of noise. At first, he regarded it with a distant, divine curiosity, but as the months and years passed, his curiosity deepened into a focused attention. He was a god of light, of flawless form and perfect harmony. His beauty was a thing of terror and wonder, as sharp and brilliant as the sun's corona, something mortals could admire from a distance, but could not look at directly without being blinded. His love was not the soft, gentle affection of mortals. It was a possessive, celestial fire, a desire for a thing that was worthy of reflecting his own perfection. He saw in Cassandra not just a beautiful mortal princess, he saw a vessel. Her spirit was as clear and unblemished as a freshly polished mirror, her mind a keen and curious instrument. He saw in her a potential oracle greater than any at Delphi, a voice through which his own divine clarity could speak to the world, and he began to desire her. His attention first manifested as a series of subtle blessings, gifts of grace that only Cassandra could perceive. When she entered his temple, the columns of sunlight that slanted through the high windows seemed to grow warmer, brighter, and to fall directly upon her. When the temple priests played the lyre in his honor, the music seemed to become richer, more complex, imbued with a harmony that no mortal hand could create. The small, fleeting visions she had always experienced began to sharpen, to gain a startling clarity. She would look at a cloud and see not just its shape, but the precise moment it would begin to rain. She would touch a budding flower and know the exact hour it would bloom. She believed these were signs of her growing piety, a reward for her unwavering devotion. She did not yet understand that they were the first whispers of a god's courtship. He began to visit her in her dreams. She would find herself walking not in the familiar streets of Troy, but in landscapes of impossible beauty, fields of glowing asphodel under a silver moon, or on a mountainside so high that the stars were within arm's reach. In these dreams, she would hear music, a melody from a golden lyre so sublime it made all earthly music sound like a child's toy. And she would hear a voice, a whisper on the edge of her consciousness, speaking fragments of poetry, riddles of the future, truths about the nature of the cosmos. She would awaken with tears on her cheeks, her heart filled with a sense of awe and a profound sacred joy, the memory of the voice, a warm echo in her soul. This growing connection set her even further apart. She tried to explain what she was experiencing to her twin Helenus, but the words failed her. He too had the gift of sight, but his was a more practical, interpretive art. He could read the omens in an eagle's flight or the entrails of a sacrifice. He did not understand the overwhelming, all-consuming presence that was beginning to fill his sister's world. He saw the light in her eyes growing brighter, but he also saw the new, faint shadows of fear and obsession that were beginning to gather there. The divine was a dangerous thing to touch so closely. Cassandra was caught in a tide of divine favor, and she was both exalted and terrified. The presence that filled her waking thoughts and sleeping dreams was beautiful, but it was also immense, a power so great it threatened to consume her own small sense of self entirely. She was the chosen of Apollo, and it was the greatest honor of her life. She did not yet realize that the love of a god is a possessive, unyielding thing, and that to be chosen by one is often indistinguishable from being trapped. The days of subtle whispers and gentle blessings were coming to an end. Apollo, a god not known for his patience, grew tired of these indirect methods. He had watched her, nurtured her gift, and filled her spirit with his presence. He had decided she was worthy. He had decided she was his. Now, it was time for him to claim his prize. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the city, Cassandra went to the temple for her final prayers of the day. The great hall was empty, the priests having retired. She knelt alone before the great golden statue of the god, her heart full of a quiet, peaceful devotion. As she finished her prayer and opened her eyes, she realized the light in the temple had not faded with the setting sun. In fact, it was growing brighter. A brilliant, impossibly pure golden light began to fill the room, a light that did not cast shadows, but seemed to burn them away. The air grew warm and began to hum with a low, powerful chord of music. Cassandra rose slowly to her feet, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a sudden breathtaking awe. She knew with absolute certainty that she was no longer alone. Book 3: A Kiss of Fire and Prophecy. The golden light intensified, a brilliant, blinding radiance that bleached the color from the marble walls and polished floors. The air in the temple grew thick and warm, humming with a powerful, silent music that vibrated not in Cassandra's ears, but in the very marrow of her bones. She shielded her eyes, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Before her, the light coalesced, solidifying from pure energy into a form that was almost but not quite human. It was Apollo, but he was not the man depicted in the golden statue. He was a being of pure, unendurable perfection. His skin glowed with the brilliance of the midday sun. His hair was a cascade of liquid gold, and his eyes were the color of molten honey, holding the calm, clear, and terrifying certainty of a god. His beauty was not comforting. It was a weapon, a declaration of the infinite chasm between mortal and divine. To look upon him was to understand one's own insignificance. He did not walk towards her, he simply was before her. When he spoke, his voice was not a sound that traveled through the air, but a resonance that bloomed directly in her mind, a chord of such perfect harmony that it made her want to weep. Cassandra, the voice sang within her, I have heard your prayers, not as pleas, but as the quiet music of a soul that seeks to understand. I have watched your devotion, Among all the mortals of this earth, your spirit is the clearest vessel. I have chosen you. Cassandra was breathless, rooted to the spot by a mixture of profound awe and primal fear. This was the moment she had unknowingly yearned for her entire life, a true and direct communion with her patron god. I will give you the gift you seek, Apollo continued, his radiant presence filling her entire world. Not the fleeting glimpses you now possess, the faint echoes of what is to come. I will give you the true sight. I will open your eyes to the great tapestry of fate. You will see the threads as I do. You will know the future in all its terrible and beautiful certainty. You will be my voice, my prophetess, the greatest the world has ever known. The offer was intoxicating, a promise of the ultimate knowledge she had always craved. It was the validation of her entire existence. But then he stated his price. In return, he said, his golden eyes gazing into her, seeing not just her face but the deepest corners of her soul. You will be mine. You will belong to me, body and spirit, my priestess, my oracle, my love, a gift for a gift. His desire was not a gentle request, it was a declaration of ownership, the calm, certain expectation of a God who had never been denied. And in that moment, a small, resilient core of Cassandra's own spirit, a very human part of her that had not yet been burned away by his divine presence, recoiled. She was in awe of him, she was devoted to him, but to be possessed by him, to surrender her entire being, her will, herself, to this beautiful, terrifying, all-consuming fire, a flicker of defiance, as surprising to her as it was to him, sparked within her. Apollo sensed her hesitation, a flicker of shadow in her otherwise pure spirit. A faint, almost imperceptible frown touched his perfect lips. He thought her fear was merely that of a mortal before the divine. He would show her the glory of what he offered, and it would extinguish all doubt. He moved closer, and the heat from him was like standing before a furnace. You do not yet understand the glory of the gift, he whispered in her mind. Let me show you. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of flesh and blood. It was a kiss of pure divine energy, of fire and light, and absolute knowledge. The moment his lips touched hers, it felt as if she had swallowed the sun. A searing, white-hot energy coursed through her, burning away the veils between the past, the present, and the future. Her mind was ripped open. The sight, the true terrible sight, flooded in. It was not a stream of gentle visions. It was a chaotic, roaring, overwhelming ocean of information. She saw the birth of stars and the cooling of the earth. She saw the rise and fall of empires that did not yet exist. She saw the entire tangled, bloody history of her own people. She saw faces and heard voices, a billion lives lived and lost all at once. The threads of fate were no longer a beautiful, abstract tapestry. They were a horrifying, screaming knot, and she was at its center. And then, with a terrifying, intimate clarity, she saw the future of Troy. She saw a fleet of 1,000 black ships on the horizon. She saw the beach stained red with the blood of heroes. She saw the gates of her beloved city burning. She saw her father Priam cut down at his own altar. She saw her mother Hecuba weeping in chains. She saw her noble brother Hector, his body dragged through the dust behind a chariot. She saw fire, smoke, and ruin, and she heard the screams of her people as their city, their song, was turned to ash. The vision was too much for a mortal mind to bear. It was an agony of knowledge, a madness of truth that threatened to shatter her sanity into 1,000 pieces. As Apollo drew back, the roaring ocean of visions receded, leaving her gasping and trembling on the temple floor, her body convulsing. He stood over her, his golden form radiating a triumphant power, certain that she was now his. But as she looked up at him, her eyes, now filled with the horror of what she had seen, held a new hard clarity. The gift was not a gift. It was a curse. It was a window into a chamber of horrors. and he was offering her a life sentence of watching, unable to act. And the price for this torment, the complete and utter surrender of herself to this beautiful, possessive God, was a price she could not pay. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she gathered herself, looked the radiant God of truth directly in the eye, and spoke a single clear and unwavering word: No. A profound silence fell upon the temple. The golden light that filled the room seemed to flicker. The beautiful, confident face of the God of light began to change. The warmth in his honey-colored eyes turned to a glacial, wounded ice. His perfect lips, which had just bestowed upon her the fire of prophecy, twisted into a snarl of pure, divine rage. His offer had been accepted, and then, at the final moment, rejected. And Apollo the Radiant, the far shooter, the god who was never denied, was not a being who handled rejection well. Book 4, The Curse of Unbelief. The word no hung in the air of the temple, a tiny, impossible piece of mortal defiance against a backdrop of divine power. For a moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The golden light that radiated from Apollo faltered, and the celestial music that hummed in the air fell silent. The god's beautiful face, a mask of perfect confidence just a second before, went utterly still. Then, slowly, it began to change. The warmth in his honey-colored eyes did not just fade, it was extinguished, replaced by a cold, glittering ice that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the cosmos. The soft, sensual curve of his lips tightened into a thin, hard line. His beauty did not vanish, but it transformed, becoming sharp, severe, and utterly merciless. It was the beauty of a drawn blade just before it strikes. A gift from a god once given cannot be taken back, he said, and his voice was no longer a song in her mind, but a sharp, cutting edge. The sight is now a part of you, Cassandra. It is woven into the fabric of your soul. You cannot unsee what I have shown you. The fire is already in your blood. You will carry it until the day you die. Cassandra trembled, understanding the terrible finality in his words. She was trapped. The agonizing visions were hers to keep. You have rejected my love, Apollo continued, taking a slow, deliberate step towards her. She scrambled backwards, pressing herself against the cold marble of a pillar. And you have insulted my honor. I cannot take back my gift, but I can amend it. I can add a postscript to our agreement. I will give you a second gift, a companion to your precious knowledge. He stood before her now, a towering figure of cold, radiant fury. She was terrified, expecting him to strike her down, to turn her into a spider or a weeping tree as other gods had done to mortals who displeased them. But his plan was far more cruel, more personal. He reached out and grabbed her chin, his grip as strong and unyielding as iron. He forced her to look into his glacial, unforgiving eyes. You crave the truth, he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. You wish to be a vessel of pure prophecy, then you shall be, but your truth will fall on deaf ears. And then he did a thing of profound divine contempt. He leaned in, and he spat in her face. It was not a violent act, but a quiet, intimate, and utterly humiliating one. His spittle was not that of a mortal. It was a drop of cold, magical poison, a liquid curse that seemed to sizzle on her skin. The moment it touched her, she felt a chilling metaphysical severance. It was as if a thick, invisible wall of glass had suddenly descended between her soul and the rest of the world. The gift of sight still burned fiercely behind her eyes, a raging fire of terrible knowledge, but she could feel, with a horrifying certainty, that the pathway for her words to reach the minds and hearts of others had been irrevocably, eternally blocked. There, Apollo said, releasing her, my second gift. You will see the truth. You will speak the truth. You will scream the truth until your lungs burn and your throat is raw, and they will look upon you and see only a mad woman. They will hear your warnings and hear only the ravings of a broken mind. Your life will be a constant, desperate cry into a soundproof void. Now you have your knowledge, Princess of Troy. See what good it does you. And with that final chilling pronouncement, he vanished. The brilliant golden light was gone, plunging the temple back into the soft, natural twilight of the setting sun. The sudden return to normal light and silence was more jarring than his presence had been. Cassandra was left gasping on the floor, trembling and violated. For a long moment, she could do nothing but try to breathe. The visions of Troy's destruction were already swirling in her mind's eye, no longer a chaotic flood, but a clear, sharp, terrifying sequence of events. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady, and stumbled out of the temple into the cool evening air of the courtyard. One of the temple guards, a kind, familiar man who had known her since she was a child, saw her distressed state and hurried over. "My princess," he said, his face etched with concern, "are you unwell? You are as pale as a ghost." As he approached, a new, small, and perfectly clear vision flashed in her mind. She saw the loose paving stone a few feet in front of him. She saw his next step, his foot catching on the edge, and his body lurching forward as he stumbled. It was a simple, insignificant event, a chance to test what had happened. "Be careful," she said, the words rushing out of her, desperate to make a connection, to prove the god wrong. "The stone before you is loose. You will trip." The guard stopped and looked at her, but he did not look down at the stone. He looked at her face, and his expression of concern slowly melted into one of deep confusion, as if she had just spoken to him in a long-dead language. He blinked, then gave her a gentle, patronizing smile. "Of course, princess," he said, his tone the one a man uses for a frightened child or a harmless lunatic. "I will be careful." He turned, took the exact step she had foreseen, and his foot caught on the edge of the loose stone. He stumbled violently, catching himself just before he fell flat on his face. He let out a curse, kicking at the offending stone. "By the gods, this path is a menace," he muttered to himself. He then straightened his uniform, gave Cassandra another strange, pitying look, and walked on, completely and utterly oblivious to the fact that she had just told him precisely what was about to happen. Cassandra stood frozen, a cold that had nothing to do with the evening air seeping into her bones. Now she understood. It wasn't that people would hear her warnings and choose to disbelieve. It was worse. Her truth was incommunicable. Her words, so clear and urgent in her own mind, reached the ears of others as meaningless noise, the babbling of a madwoman. She was trapped. She was a prisoner inside her own skull, the sole, sane inhabitant of a world that was marching towards its doom, while the bars of her cage were the loving, pitying, uncomprehending faces of everyone she knew. The sun had now fully set. The visions of her burning city were raging behind her eyes, and she understood, with a certainty that crushed her soul, that she had a voice, but she would never be heard again. Book 5. The First Unheard Warning. Cassandra awoke to the familiar, gentle light of a Trojan morning filtering through her window, but the world it illuminated was no longer her own. Sleep had offered no escape, only a different kind of torment. Her dreams had been a chaotic storm of prophecy, fragmented visions of distant lands and future sorrows, leaving her exhausted and with a headache that felt like a physical echo of the god's terrible gift. She sat up, the silken sheets of her bed feeling alien against her skin, and looked around her room. Everything was as it should be. The tapestries on the wall, the polished wooden furniture, the view of the sunlit palace gardens, and yet everything was wrong. The world was the same, but she had been fundamentally, irrevocably changed. She was now a stranger in her own home. She dressed with a heavy sense of dread, forcing herself to go through the motions of a normal morning. She had to try. She had to see the full extent of the curse, to test the bars of her new prison. She joined her family for the morning meal in the great hall. The air was filled with the easy, cheerful chatter of her many siblings, the scent of fresh bread and fruit, the familiar presence of her parents, King Priam and Queen Hecuba, presiding over their large and happy family. It was a scene of perfect domestic peace. For Cassandra, it was an agony. Her new sight was not a switch she could turn on or off. It was a constant, low-level hum of information. As she sat at the table, she was bombarded with 1,000 tiny, insignificant futures. She saw a servant, who was just now pouring wine, would stumble in a few moments, spilling the entire jug on her brother Dephobus. She saw that the clasp on her sister Polyxena's necklace was loose and would soon break. She saw her father frowning over a dispatch that a messenger had not yet even delivered. It was a maddening, overwhelming chorus of irrelevant detail. She forced herself to remain silent, to eat, to smile when spoken to, feeling like a spy at her own family's table. After the meal, some of her younger brothers began to play in the sun-drenched central courtyard, their laughter echoing off the marble columns. One of them, a small boy of 5, was playing with a new toy, a beautifully crafted wooden chariot, a miniature replica of the one his father rode in. He pulled it happily across the polished floor, making the sounds of a galloping horse. Cassandra watched him, a faint smile touching her lips, a brief moment of normalcy. And then it happened. A vision, sharp and clear as glass, sliced through her mind. It was not a vague feeling or a dream. She saw the little wooden chariot, its wheels rolling smoothly, picking up speed as it headed directly for the low, decorative balustrade of a second-story overlook. She saw her little brother, lost in his game, chasing after it. She saw the toy pass under the railing and fall to the stone patio below, and she saw her brother, not stopping, lunge after it, his small body toppling over the edge into empty air, a scream caught in her throat. The vision was so real, so immediate, she felt her own stomach lurch. She jumped to her feet and ran to her mother, who was watching the children with a fond expression. "Mother, stop him!" Cassandra cried, her voice high and strained with panic. She grabbed Hecuba's arm, her grip desperate. "Polites, his chariot. It's going to go over the edge of the balcony, and he will fall. You have to stop him now." Hecuba turned, her smile fading as she saw the wild, terrified look in her daughter's eyes. She saw the frantic expression, the desperate plea, but she did not hear the words of warning. The curse twisted them. In her ears, Cassandra's urgent cry was just a jumble of frantic, nonsensical sounds, the babbling of a mind in distress. Her maternal concern immediately shifted from the child playing safely in the sun to the clearly tormented daughter standing before her. "Hush now, my love." "Hush," Hecuba said, her voice soft and soothing as she pulled Cassandra into a comforting embrace. She stroked her hair, trying to calm her. "It is all right. You are safe. You've just had a waking nightmare, a bad dream. Look, he is perfectly fine. It is just a toy." "No, you don't understand," Cassandra insisted, trying to pull away, her frustration mounting into a frantic desperation. "It's not a dream. It's going to happen." But the more she struggled, the more convinced Hecuba became that her daughter was in the grip of some terrible fit. "Guards," she said calmly, her arms holding Cassandra tight. "Bring the princess some cool water. She is overwrought." And as Hecuba's attention was focused entirely on soothing her mad daughter, no one was watching the little boy. The wooden chariot, pulled by its imaginary horses, rolled smoothly across the floor. It picked up speed. It headed directly for the balustrade. It passed neatly under the railing and disappeared over the edge. "My toy!" the little boy cried, and without a thought, he ran after it. He reached the edge, and just as the vision had shown, he lunged forward, his small body pitching over the railing. A collective gasp of horror came from the queen and her attendants. But before the boy could fall, a nearby guard, reacting with lightning speed, leaped forward and grabbed his ankle, pulling the dangling, shrieking child back to safety. The courtyard erupted in a flurry of activity. The child was swept up into his mother's arms, who covered him with kisses and tears of relief. The guard was praised for his quick reflexes. An order was given to have the balustrade raised immediately. They all talked at once about the carelessness of children and the grace of the gods for averting a tragedy. In the midst of the chaos, Cassandra stood alone, her arms now released. A cold, dreadful calm washed over her. The prophecy had come true, every single detail, and no one had seen it. "I told you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I told you what would happen." Her mother looked at her, her relief momentarily replaced by a look of deep pity and a flicker of fear. "Yes, my poor child," she said, her voice filled with a terrible misplaced understanding. "Your distress must have distracted us all. It is all right now. You need to rest." And in that moment, Cassandra understood the true, exquisite cruelty of Apollo's curse. It was not just that they would not believe her, it was that they would take her truth and twist it, reframing it as a symptom of her madness. Her warnings would not be seen as warnings, but as disturbances, perhaps even the cause of the very tragedies she sought to prevent. Evidence did not matter. The more she insisted she was right, the crazier she would seem. She allowed them to lead her back to her room, their soothing words and pitying glances a far greater torment than any physical punishment could be. She now knew her fate. She was the sole witness to the future, a prophetess in a world of the blind, but the curse had bound her tongue and sealed their ears. She was doomed to watch, to know, and to be utterly, completely, and forever alone with the truth. Book 6. The Dream of the Firebrand. Years passed. The acute, searing pain of Cassandra's curse settled into a chronic, dull ache in her soul. She learned a bitter and necessary lesson: silence. She no longer ran to her mother with warnings of scraped knees, nor did she caution the palace guards about loose stones. She learned to watch the tiny, inevitable tragedies of daily life unfold without a word, her face a mask of calm composure. She walled her visions inside herself, building a fortress of silence around her tormented mind. To the court she became a figure of quiet, melancholic beauty, the strange, devout princess who had recovered from a bout of youthful hysteria and was now content to spend her days in quiet prayer. They saw her silence as peace. She knew it was a constant, exhausting war. She was a sentry on the walls of a city that could not see the enemy, and she was forbidden from sounding the alarm. This fragile peace was shattered on the night her mother, Queen Hecuba, announced she was once again with child. The palace was filled with joy. A new prince or princess was a blessing, a sign of Troy's continued strength and prosperity. But that night, as the city celebrated, Cassandra fell into a sleep that was not rest, but a descent into a vision more powerful and terrifying than any she had ever known. She dreamt she was in the great birthing chamber with her mother. But Hecuba did not give birth to a child of flesh and blood. From her womb she brought forth a blazing, crackling torch, a firebrand of pure, destructive flame. In the dream, the torch rolled from the birthing bed, across the marble floor, and out into the corridors of the palace. Wherever it touched, the tapestries and wooden beams would burst into flame. It rolled out of the great gates of the city, setting fire to the sacred groves and the golden fields of wheat. Finally, it came to rest at the foot of the city's unbreachable walls, and the great towers of Troy themselves began to burn, consumed by the fire that had been born in the queen's own bed. She saw the city turn to ash, and she awoke with a scream caught in her throat, the smell of smoke thick in her nostrils, her heart hammering with the absolute certainty of what she had seen. The child her mother carried was not a blessing, it was the torch that would burn their world to the ground. For days she was torn. Her hard-won silence had been a shield to protect her from the pain of being disbelieved. But this was not a scraped knee or a spilled jug of wine. This was the fate of her entire civilization. She could not stay silent. She had to try. She went before her parents, the king and queen, in the throne room. She was no longer a frantic, panicked girl. She was a young woman with the terrible weight of prophecy in her eyes. Calmly, clearly, and with a desperate, controlled intensity, she recounted her dream. She did not rave or weep. She explained the symbolism, the clear and present danger the vision represented. "This child must not live," she said, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "If you allow him to draw breath, he will be the breath that fans the flames of our destruction. I have seen it." Priam and Hecuba were deeply shaken. A dream of a royal birth is a powerful omen, and the image of the firebrand was horrifying. Priam, a wise and just king, did not dismiss his daughter out of hand. Her quiet, solemn certainty was more disturbing than any of her childhood fits had been. He summoned the other seers of his court, chief among them his son Asakis, who was known for his skill in interpreting dreams. Asakis listened to Cassandra's account, his face growing pale. He consulted his scrolls, he read the signs, and he returned to the king with a grim expression. "The princess speaks the truth," he confirmed. "The dream is a clear prophecy. The child to be born will bring about the fall of Ilium." Now the terror was real. It was no longer the vision of one unstable girl, but a warning confirmed by a respected seer. And yet the curse of Apollo was a subtle and insidious thing. It did not just make people disbelieve Cassandra's words, it made it impossible for them to fully act upon the truths she revealed. Priam and Hecuba heard the warnings. They even on some level believed them, but to take the necessary action to kill their own unborn child, the love of a parent for their infant, the horror of such a cold-blooded act, was a more powerful force than the abstract terror of a prophecy. They could not do it. They chose a compromise, a half measure that they hoped would appease the fates while salving their own consciences. When the child was born, a beautiful, healthy boy they named Paris, they did not kill him. Instead, they gave him to a trusted shepherd with the order to leave the infant on the remote, wild slopes of Mount Ida to be exposed to the elements. His fate would be left in the hands of the gods. To them, it was a solution. The threat was removed from the city, but Cassandra watched the shepherd depart, and her heart was a stone of ice in her chest. The fire had not been extinguished. It had simply been taken out of sight, cast into the wilderness, where it would be tended by a stranger's hand, its flames slowly growing stronger in the shadows, waiting for the day it would return to consume them all. Book 7, The Judgment of Paris. Nearly 2 decades passed. Troy continued to flourish, its towers gleaming under the sun, its people secure behind their great walls. The story of the infant prince left on the mountain became a sad, half-forgotten palace secret. For everyone except Cassandra, the prophecy of the firebrand had faded into the realm of a bad dream, averted by the sad but necessary actions of the king. Cassandra alone knew that the fire was not out. She could feel it, a low, ominous hum on the edge of her senses, a future waiting to happen. The event that would provide the spark for this fire began not in the world of mortals, but in the glittering, petty, and dangerously vain world of the gods. On Olympus, a grand wedding was being held, a union between the lovely sea nymph Thetis and a mortal king named Peleus. All the gods and goddesses were invited to the magnificent feast, their laughter and music echoing through the heavens. All, that is a goddess of discord, had been deliberately left off the guest list, for the hosts knew that wherever she went, trouble followed. This, of course, was a grave miscalculation. To be snubbed is one thing, but to snub the very embodiment of strife is to invite a catastrophe. Eris, furious at the insult, crafted a simple, perfect, and devastating revenge. She appeared for a moment at the edge of the celebration, unseen, and rolled a single beautiful object among the guests, a solid golden apple upon which were inscribed the words, "To Callisti, to the fairest." The apple rolled to a stop at the feet of the three most powerful goddesses on Olympus: Hera, the stately queen of the gods; Athena, the fierce goddess of wisdom; and Aphrodite, the radiant goddess of love and beauty. A tense silence fell. Each believed with absolute certainty that the apple was meant for her. The ensuing argument was immediate, bitter, and threatened to tear the divine court apart. Zeus, the king of them all, found himself in an impossible position. To choose one would be to earn the eternal enmity of the other two. With a stroke of cunning political genius, he abdicated responsibility. He declared that such a momentous decision could not be made by a biased party. It required a neutral judge, a mortal of pure and simple heart, known for his fairness. He chose a handsome young shepherd who lived on the slopes of Mount Ida, a man who had once judged a dispute between bulls with impeccable fairness. The shepherd's name was Paris. Back in Troy, Cassandra knew nothing of the wedding or the apple, but on the day Hermes was sent to lead the three goddesses to the unsuspecting shepherd, she was seized by a series of agonizing, fragmented visions. She was in her chambers, trying to weave, when her mind was suddenly assaulted with images. She saw a gleaming golden fruit. She saw the faces of three impossibly beautiful and terrifyingly angry goddesses. She saw a handsome young man on a mountainside, his face a mask of awe and fear, a young man who felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream. And then she saw another face, the face of a woman of such stunning beauty that it made her own heart ache, a woman with the regal bearing of a Spartan queen. She felt the threads of fate which had lain dormant for so long, suddenly being pulled taut, woven into a terrible, intricate noose that was tightening around the neck of her city. A wave of cold dread washed over her, so powerful it made her physically sick. She did not know what the visions meant, not precisely, but she knew they were connected. She knew that something of cosmic importance had just been set in motion, something that involved the worlds of both gods and men, and she knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the handsome, familiar shepherd on the mountain was the firebrand, her brother, the one they had tried to discard. The chapter of fate that she had dreaded for 20 years was about to begin. On that lonely mountainside, Paris, overwhelmed and terrified, listened as the three great goddesses offered him their bribes. Hera offered him power over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in every battle. But Aphrodite, goddess of love, smiled, and she made a simple, irresistible promise. She would give him the most beautiful mortal woman in the world to be his wife. He chose Aphrodite. He handed her the golden apple, and in that moment, the fate of Troy was sealed. The two scorned goddesses departed, their hearts filled with a cold divine hatred for the shepherd and for the city that had produced him. Aphrodite, triumphant, departed with a promise to fulfill her side of the bargain. Miles away, in the palace of Troy, Cassandra collapsed, a single choked sob escaping her lips. She did not need to see the end to know what had just happened. The firebrand she had seen in her dreams had just been handed a lit torch, and he was about to begin his long journey home. Book 8, The Forgotten Prince. Years passed, and the wound in Cassandra's soul, while never healing, scarred over into a kind of functional despair. The vision still came, a constant, unwelcome torrent of information, but she learned to build walls against them, to quiet her face and her tongue while the storm raged within her. She moved through the sunlit halls of the Trojan palace like a ghost, a silent observer in her own life. To her family, her silence was a welcome peace, a sign that her strange fits of madness had finally passed. They did not know, could not comprehend, that her silence was not peace, but the quiet of a graveyard, a heart that had buried too many futures. The city of Troy, in its blissful ignorance, continued to thrive, and one year King Priam announced that great funeral games would be held. They were to honor the memory of the son he had lost so long ago, the infant prince who had been left on the slopes of Mount Ida. It was an act of public mourning and private guilt, a way for the king to finally put the sad memory to rest. From all the surrounding lands, champions and athletes came to compete, and from the pastures of Mount Ida, a young man, a shepherd of uncommon grace and beauty, decided to travel to the great city to test his own strength. He did not know his own story, only that a goddess had promised him a destiny far greater than tending sheep. His name was Paris. As his delegation approached the mighty walls of Troy, Cassandra, who was walking in the palace gardens, was struck by a vision so powerful it brought her to her knees. The world around her dissolved, and she saw him, the handsome shepherd, his features so achingly familiar. But she saw more than just a man. She saw an aura clinging to him, a shimmering golden haze of divine favor, the unmistakable scent of Aphrodite's magic, and behind him she saw what he was pulling in his wake, 1,000 black-sailed ships, the fury of a spurned king, and a great all-consuming fire. The firebrand had returned. The carefully constructed walls of her silence shattered. This was not a small domestic tragedy she could swallow down. This was the beginning of the end. A primal scream of pure terror tore from her throat, and she ran. She ran through the palace corridors, her royal robes flying behind her, and down the great stone steps to the Scaean Gate, the main entrance to the city. She reached it just as Paris and his companions were about to enter. She threw herself before them, a wild, disheveled figure, her eyes blazing with the terrible light of her sight. "Do not let him enter," she shrieked, her voice raw with a desperation that had been suppressed for 20 years. "He is not who you think. He is a torch meant to burn these walls. He is the doom of Troy. Close the gates, turn him away, or we are all lost." The guards stared at her, frozen in shock and confusion. Her brothers, Hector and Deiphobus, who were there to welcome the guests, rushed forward. They saw not a prophetess, but their poor mad sister, having another of her terrible fits. "Cassandra, enough," Hector commanded, his voice firm but laced with pity, as he and his brother took her by the arms. "You are unwell. You are frightening our guests." They tried to lead her away, but she fought them, her slight frame filled with a frantic strength. "You are blind," she wept, tears streaming down her face. "You welcome our ruin. He will be the death of us all." But her words were just noise to them, the ravings of a broken mind. They dragged her back towards the palace, her screams echoing off the great walls, as Paris, with a look of pity and confusion on his handsome face, was welcomed into the city of his birth. The games began, and the young shepherd, divinely favored and possessing a natural, God-given athleticism, excelled at everything. He outran the swiftest champions, outthrew the strongest, and proved himself the victor. In the final ceremony, King Priam, deeply impressed, asked the young man his name and lineage. It was then that the old shepherd who had raised Paris stepped forward, and with a trembling hand presented the king with the small embroidered blanket in which the infant had been wrapped so long ago. The recognition was instant. Priam and Hecubus stared, their faces a mask of disbelief, then dawning, overwhelming joy. Their son, their lost child, was alive. He had not died on the mountain. He had returned, a champion, a man of astonishing beauty and grace. In the flood of their parental love and relief, the dark prophecy of the firebrand was utterly forgotten, washed away like a bad dream in the bright light of their son's miraculous return. The entire city erupted in celebration. A feast was called, and the forgotten prince was welcomed back into the royal family with tears and laughter. But as the palace halls filled with music and joyous shouts, Cassandra sat alone in her locked chamber, the sounds a distant torture. She watched from her high window as her family embraced the handsome, smiling young man. They saw a lost son returned. She saw a beautiful, hollow vessel for a goddess's vanity. They saw a miracle. She saw a death sentence, signed, sealed, and now delivered directly into the heart of their home. Book 9, The Ship That Sailed for Doom. Paris, the shepherd prince, took to his new life with an effortless, charming grace. He shed his rustic clothes for the fine linens and gold of a Trojan royal, and he learned the ways of the court with a speed that delighted his family. He was handsome, witty, and possessed a carefree confidence that came from a lifetime of simple living, now bolstered by the secret knowledge that a goddess had promised him the world's greatest prize. He was adored by the people and doted upon by his parents. The entire city, it seemed, was enchanted by him, all except Cassandra. She watched him from a distance, her heart cold with dread. She saw the carelessness in his charm, the entitlement in his easy smile. She saw a man who had never known responsibility, a man who believed that beauty was a currency that could buy anything, a man guided not by wisdom or duty, but by the intoxicating whisper of a selfish goddess. To her, he was not a charming prince. He was a walking embodiment of Troy's fatal flaw, a prideful belief in its own invincibility. A year passed, and Paris grew restless. The promise of Aphrodite burned in his mind. He began to speak of a diplomatic mission, a voyage across the sea to Sparta, to the court of King Menelaus. The official reason was to negotiate a treaty, a trivial matter of statecraft, but Cassandra knew the real reason. A new vision had seized her, clearer and more terrible than any before. She saw her brother in the opulent halls of a foreign king. She saw him standing before the most beautiful woman she had ever imagined, a woman with eyes like the summer sea and hair the color of spun gold. She saw the spark of a forbidden passion, fanned into a flame by a goddess's invisible hand, and she saw Paris's ship sailing away from the Spartan shore, no longer with just a crew, but with a stolen queen. She saw the rage on King Menelaus's face, and she saw the 1,000 black ships of the Achaean kings gathering like a storm cloud on the horizon. This was the catalyst. This was the moment the firebrand would be lit. She knew this was her last chance to stop the inevitable. She confronted Paris one evening as he walked in the gardens, his mind full of his impending adventure. "Do not go," she said, her voice low and intense, stripped of all madness, leaving only the cold, hard weight of certainty. "If you set sail for Sparta, you will bring back a fire that will consume us all. You will bring a woman whose beauty will be our shroud. For her this city will burn, our father will be slain, and our brothers will die in the dust. I have seen it." Paris stopped and looked at his strange, intense sister. He did not hear a prophecy. He heard the gloomy, jealous ramblings of a woman who could not stand to see him happy. "You speak in riddles, sister," he said with a dismissive, charming smile. "Do not worry so. It is only a short voyage. I will return with honor for Troy." Desperate, she went to her father Priam and her dearest brother Hector. She fell to her knees before them, pleading with them not to sanction the journey. "Father, he is not going for a treaty. He is going to fulfill a vain promise from a selfish goddess. Hector, you are the protector of Troy. Do not let him go. His ship will be our hearse." Hector looked at her, his noble face filled with a deep, sorrowful pity. He loved his sister, but her mind was a land of shadows he could not enter. He saw her terror, and it pained him, but he could not believe its cause. Priam, still blinded by the joy of his son's return, saw only a girl whose melancholy was spoiling their happiness. They soothed her with kind words, promised her it would be all right, and then they gave Paris their blessing, a fleet of ships, and a royal retinue for his voyage. The narrative followed Paris across the Aegean. He was welcomed in Sparta with all the honor due to a Trojan prince. King Menelaus opened his home to him, a fatal mistake of hospitality. And there, in the great hall, Paris saw her, Helen. She was even more beautiful than the goddess had promised. Aphrodite's magic was a potent, irresistible force. It wrapped itself around the two of them, and in the space of a few short days, under the guise of diplomacy, a reckless, passionate affair began. It was not a violent abduction, it was a mutual, willing flight. Convinced by Paris's promises and the goddess's magic that this was her true destiny, Helen agreed to leave her husband, her child, and her kingdom, and flee with him to Troy. Days later, The lookout on the highest tower of Ilium cried out. Prince Paris's ships had been spotted on the horizon. A crowd gathered at the port, eager to welcome their charming prince home. Cassandra watched from a high terrace of the palace, her body as cold and still as the stone beneath her feet. The main ship docked. The ramp was lowered. Prince Paris stepped onto the shore, his face beaming with triumph. And then he turned and offered his hand. A woman stepped off the ship after him, her form cloaked in a sea blue traveling robe. She lifted her head and lowered her hood, and a collective gasp went through the assembled crowd. It was Helen. Her beauty was an audible event, a sudden silence that fell over the entire harbor. It was a divine, otherworldly beauty that seemed to steal the very breath from the air. The Trojan people, lovers of beauty above all else, were instantly and completely captivated. They did not see a stolen wife or the cause of a future war. They saw a goddess who had chosen to walk among them, a prize that confirmed their city's greatness. They began to cheer, but from her high vantage point, Cassandra watched the joyous welcome, and she did not see a beautiful queen. As she looked at Helen's perfect, smiling face, she saw the flames of the pyre. She saw the skulls of her brothers. She saw the tears of her mother. She saw the end of all things, wrapped in a package of breathtaking, irresistible beauty. The doom of Troy had not come as a monster or an invading army. It had arrived with a smile, and the city was rushing to embrace it with open arms. Book X, The Welcoming of Doom. The arrival of Helen was not merely an event, it was a phenomenon. As Paris led her through the Scalan Gate and up the grand processional way to the palace, the life of the city came to a standstill. Merchants left their stalls, weavers abandoned their looms, and children stopped their games, all drawn by the magnetic force of a beauty so perfect it seemed to defy mortal limits. The Trojan people, who valued artistry, passion, and beauty above all else, saw her not as the stolen wife of a foreign king, but as a divine prize, a living testament to their prince's charm and their city's greatness. To them, her presence was a victory in itself, a bloodless conquest over their sullen Greek rivals. That evening, the palace was ablaze with light and sound. King Priam, his heart overflowing with joy for his returned son, and dazzled by the celestial beauty of his new guest, called for the greatest feast Troy had seen in a generation. The great hall was filled with music, with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, and with the triumphant laughter of the Trojan nobility. They toasted Prince Paris, and they toasted the beautiful Helen, who sat beside him, a radiant, smiling, and perhaps slightly bewildered goddess at the center of their adoration. In the midst of this jubilant chaos, a debate was held in the king's private council chambers. The city's elders, along with Priam's wisest sons, gathered to discuss the monumental implications of what had just happened. A few cautious voices, led by the wise and aging Antenor, urged restraint. They spoke of the laws of hospitality that Paris had broken, of the might of the Achaean kingdoms, and of the wrath of a spurned husband like King Menelaus. To keep her is to invite a war we cannot be certain of winning, Antenor argued, his voice a low rumble of reason in a room drunk on pride. But his words were drowned out by the louder, more passionate voices of the young princes, who, buoyed by wine and arrogance, spoke of Troy's invincibility and Paris's right to his prize. And Priam, looking at the handsome face of the son he had almost lost, saw not a reckless youth who had endangered them all, but a hero who had brought home a treasure worthy of the gods. His love for his son blinded him to the danger. The council concluded. Helen would be granted sanctuary. She would be welcomed as a princess of Troy. The decision was made. Fate was sealed. It was at that moment, as the king was about to return to the feast to announce his verdict, that the great doors to the chamber were thrown open with a violent crash. Cassandra stood on the threshold, her hair unbound, her eyes wide with the fire of her sight, her simple white robe a stark contrast to the festive attire of the court. She no longer looked like a princess. She looked like an incarnation of pure prophetic fury. Fools, she screamed, her voice not that of a mad woman, but a sound of such profound, terrible clarity that it momentarily silenced the room. You sit here debating while our funeral pyre is being built. You celebrate while the ghosts of our children are already beginning to weep. She strode into the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over her stunned father and brothers. I see it. I see the 1,000 black ships that your decision will call forth from the sea. I see the beaches of our home choked with the bodies of the dead. I see the river Scamander running red, not with water, but with the blood of Trojan princes. Her voice rose to a fever pitch of agony and rage. She pointed a trembling finger at the distant sounds of the feast. You welcome a queen? You have welcomed a plague. That woman is not a bride for Paris. She is a fury sent from the depths of Tartarus, a demon cloaked in beauty. Her face will be the torch that lights our pyre. Her name will be the curse that echoes in our ruins. A horrified silence fell over the council. They stared at her not with belief, but with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and deep, profound pity. Priam's face was a mask of sorrow. The daughter he loved was truly, irrevocably lost to madness. Enough, he said, his voice heavy with a father's pain. Guards, take the princess to her chambers. See that she is kept calm and comfortable. She is unwell. Her illness grows worse tonight. The guards approached her gently, as one would approach a frightened, wounded animal. She did not struggle. The fire in her eyes died down, replaced by a look of utter, desolate defeat. She had screamed the truth with all the force of her soul, and they had only heard the ravings of a lunatic. As they led her away, she passed the main archway to the feasting hall. For a brief moment, her eyes met those of Helen, who was watching the commotion from afar. The beautiful queen looked at the screaming, disheveled princess with a cool, detached curiosity, the look a goddess might give to a strange and chaotic mortal ritual. She felt no guilt, no fear. She simply turned back to the celebration. Cassandra was taken to her rooms, and the heavy wooden door was barred from the outside. She was now a prisoner in her own home. She stood in the center of her silent chamber and listened to the sounds of joyous music and triumphant laughter that drifted up from the hall below, the sounds of her city celebrating the beginning of its own destruction. Book 11, 10 Years of a Prophet's Tears. The black ships came, just as Cassandra had seen, 1,000 of them, a forest of masts on the horizon, their sails blotting out the morning sun. The combined might of the Achaean kings had assembled to reclaim their stolen queen and to punish the pride of Troy. To the Trojan people, filled with a defiant confidence in their mighty walls, the sight was a thrilling, terrible spectacle, the beginning of a great and glorious war. To Cassandra, watching from her high window, it was the beginning of a funeral, 10 years long. The war was not the glorious series of duels the poets would later sing of. It was a decade of slow, grinding attrition, a brutal and bloody stalemate. The initial excitement of the Trojans curdled into a grim routine of survival. The city became a cage, its people stalked by the constant companions of a long siege, hunger, sickness, and the gnawing acid of fear. For 10 years, Cassandra lived in a state of dual torment, the suffering of the present war, and the clear, unwavering vision of the far greater horrors yet to come. Her life became a series of small, agonizing prophetic vignettes, each one a fresh confirmation of her curse. She would see one of her younger, lesser-known brothers arming for a skirmish, and a sharp, clear vision would strike her. She would see him falling in the dust, a specific arc of spear piercing his throat. She would run to him, pleading, "Do not go today. I see your death by the ships." He would just laugh, ruffle her hair, and call her his little bird of ill omen. "We all must die someday, sister. Today I will earn my glory." And by evening the news would come, exactly as she had seen, and the palace would be filled with fresh wailing, a sound she had already heard in her own mind hours before. She foresaw the plague that swept through the Greek camp in the 9th year, a punishment from her own patron god Apollo. She understood its cause, Agamemnon's insult to the god's priest. She tried to explain the strategic advantage to her father's war council. The Greeks are weakened, she insisted. Their best warrior is not fighting. The gods are fighting amongst themselves. Now is the time to press the attack. But they saw only her flushed cheeks and wild eyes. They dismissed her tactical insights as the feverish ramblings of a girl who knew nothing of war. Her greatest agony, however, was reserved for her noblest and most beloved brother, Hector. She had watched him for 10 years, the brave protector of Troy, the one pillar of strength that kept the city from collapsing. And for 10 years she had carried the terrible vision of his end. The day finally came when Achilles, mad with grief over the death of his companion Patroclus, returned to the battlefield. Cassandra was seized by a vision so clear, so detailed, that it felt as if she were living it. She saw Hector, brave and proud, wearing the very armor Achilles had once owned, taken from the body of Patroclus. She saw the duel, the chase around the walls of Troy. She saw Achilles, guided by Athena, spot the one tiny, fatal vulnerability in that armor, a small gap near the collarbone. She saw the spear strike home. She ran, a specter of desperation, to find him as he was arming for the final time. She fell at his feet, clinging to his legs, her words a torrent of tears and pleas. "Hector, my brother, I beg you, do not go out today. Do not face him. He cannot be beaten, and I see your death as clearly as I see your face. Stay within the walls, just for one day." Hector looked down at his weeping sister, and his heart ached for her. He loved her dearly, but he was a man bound by a code of honor that was as unyielding as the city walls. He could not refuse the challenge. To do so would be to live in shame, and for a hero like Hector, shame was a fate worse than death. He gently lifted her to her feet, his expression full of a deep, sorrowful pity. "Dear sister," he said, his voice soft, "all men are bound by their fate. No man, brave or coward, has ever escaped it. My fate is to protect Troy. I must go." He kissed her forehead, a final, gentle farewell, and walked out to meet his doom, deaf to the one voice that could have saved him. Later that day, the news arrived. Hector was dead. Achilles, in his rage, was defiling the body, dragging it behind his chariot in the dust. A great collective wail of despair rose from the city, a sound of a people who had just lost their heart. In the midst of the palace's frantic, fresh grief, Cassandra was a pillar of dreadful calm. Her tears had been shed long ago. Her grief for Hector was 10 years old. She had been mourning him every single day of the war. After the tense truce and the return of Hector's body, the city held his funeral. Troy had lost its greatest protector. Its spirit was broken. As Cassandra stood on the walls, watching the smoke rise from her brother's pyre, she looked out at the distant, smoldering campfires of the Achaean army. The war was not over. The death of the hero was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of the final chapter before the epilogue. And the worst, she knew with a chilling, soul-wearying certainty, was still to come. Book 12. The Ghost of Achilles. The death of Hector left a wound in the heart of Troy from which it would never recover. The city's spirit was broken. In his place, a new and more terrifying force dominated the battlefield. Achilles, unchained from all restraint, a demigod consumed by a grief so profound it had burned away all traces of his humanity. He fought now not for glory, but for vengeance, a relentless, unstoppable force of destruction. The Trojan soldiers, once so proud, now huddled behind their walls, their courage shattered, knowing that to face Achilles was to face a death that was both certain and terrible. The days that followed were dark. Troy was a city under siege, not just by an army, but by the wrath of a single man. Amid this atmosphere of fear and despair, Cassandra was struck by a new vision. It came to her not in a dream, but in a waking trance, as she stood on the city walls, looking out at the distant Greek encampment. She saw her brother Paris, but he was not the charming, carefree prince she knew. He was an instrument, his form cloaked in shadow, a bow in his hand. She saw him hiding by the Skyan gate, the very gate through which he had proudly led Helen years before. She saw an arrow knocked on his bowstring, its bronze tip glowing with a faint, divine light. And she saw the hand of a god, a radiant, beautiful, and vengeful hand, resting invisibly on Paris's shoulder, guiding his aim. It was the hand of Apollo. Then her vision shifted to the battlefield, to the raging, magnificent figure of Achilles. The vision zoomed in, showing her his entire body, invulnerable as stone, except for one small mortal point, the heel of his left foot, the one spot his mother's hand had held when she dipped him in the river Styx. The vision was a perfect, terrible equation. The puppet, the god, the arrow, and the fatal flaw. For the first time since the war began, a vision brought not just despair, but a sliver of twisted, agonizing hope, the death of Achilles. It was possible, if their most feared enemy could be slain, perhaps the war could still be won, but the hope was a bitter poison. She saw that this victory would not be a triumph of Trojan valor, but a calculated act of divine revenge, another move in the gods' cruel game. Apollo was not saving Troy. He was merely settling his own score with the Greek who had defiled his temple. She was torn. Should she speak? Should she try to guide the hand of fate? Her warnings were always ignored, but what of a prophecy that promised victory? She found her brother Paris, not in the war council, but in the palace, polishing his bow, an instrument he favored far more than the sword and shield. She approached him, her face a calm, unreadable mask. "The gods favor you today, brother," she said, her voice a low, even whisper. "If you seek to earn the glory that has so far eluded you, take your bow and hide yourself by the western side of the Scaean gate. An opportunity will be granted to you. Do not waste it." The curse twisted her words. Paris did not hear a prophecy. He heard a strange yet encouraging vote of confidence from his gloomy sister. He saw it not as a divine instruction, but as a good omen, a spur to his own ambition. He smiled at her, a rare moment of connection between the two of them. "Perhaps you are not such a bird of ill omen after all, sister," he said, and with a newfound resolve he went to do as she had suggested. From her high vantage point on the walls, Cassandra watched the terrible prophecy unfold. She saw Achilles, a whirlwind of death, drive the Trojan forces back towards the city, and she saw Paris, hidden in the shadows of the gate tower, draw his bow. He fired the arrow, a hopeful, desperate shot into the chaos. Cassandra saw what others could not, the radiant form of Apollo appearing for a split second beside the arrow, guiding its flight, turning it from a random shaft into a missile of absolute destiny. The arrow flew true. It struck Achilles in his one mortal spot. The great demigod, the unkillable hero, stumbled. A look of shocked disbelief crossed his face. He reached down and pulled the arrow from his heel, and then, with a roar that was a mixture of rage and agony, he fell. A moment of stunned silence fell over the battlefield. Then, a great triumphant shout erupted from the walls of Troy. They had done the impossible. The butcher of Hector, the terror of the plains, was dead. That night, the city did not feel like a place under siege. It felt like a city that had already won the war. The streets were filled with singing and the sounds of celebration. Paris was hailed as the greatest of heroes, the savior of his people. But amid the joyous revelry, Cassandra stood alone on the palace balcony, the cold night wind whipping at her hair. She looked at her brother being carried on the shoulders of cheering soldiers, and she saw only a puppet whose strings had been cut, his divine purpose served. She knew that killing Achilles did not end the war. It prolonged it. It created a power vacuum in the Greek camp that would be filled with ambition and jealousy. She could already see the ghost of Achilles, a vengeful, towering shade, demanding more blood, more honor, more death. The Trojans thought they had slain the great lion that was hunting them. Cassandra knew they had only succeeded in breaking open the cage of 1,000 hungrier wolves. Book 13, The Madness of Ajax. The death of Achilles sent a shock wave of grief and disarray through the Greek camp. They held a great funeral for their fallen champion, the smoke from his pyre a dark stain against the sky. But once the formal mourning was over, a bitter and dangerous question arose: who was now worthy of his arms? It was not merely a matter of taking his sword and shield. His armor had been forged by the god Hephaestus himself. It was a divine relic, a symbol of honor, and the mark of the greatest living hero among the Achaeans. Two men, by common consent, had the strongest claim. The first was Ajax the Great, a giant of a man, a warrior second only to Achilles in strength and brute courage. He was a man of simple, immense pride, who believed that valor in battle was the only true measure of a hero. The second was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, a man known not for his strength, but for his cunning, his silver tongue, and his brilliant strategic mind. From her lonely chamber within Troy's walls, Cassandra watched this new drama unfold in a series of sharp, clear visions. The curse that prevented her from being heard had over the long years sharpened her internal sight to a razor's edge. She saw the great assembly of the Greek kings as if she were there among them. She heard the powerful, straightforward speech of Ajax, who listed his heroic deeds, his unwavering courage, his loyalty. He stood for the old way of the hero, strength and honor above all. Then she heard the clever, persuasive, and masterfully manipulative words of Odysseus, who argued that it was his strategy, not brute force, that had kept the Achaean army from collapsing, and that he alone had the intelligence to wield the symbolic power of the armor. She saw the political maneuvering of the great kings, Agamemnon and Menelaus, who had always been wary of Ajax's blunt pride and were far more comfortable with the pliable cunning of Odysseus. The vote was held. The divine armor of Achilles was awarded to Odysseus. Cassandra saw the look on Ajax's face, and a cold pity touched her heart. She saw a great, simple, and noble man utterly broken by the verdict. To him, this was not just the loss of a prize, it was a public declaration that his entire code of honor was worthless, that trickery was now valued more highly than bravery. His world had been turned upside down, his immense pride shattered into 1,000 pieces. That night, she saw him in her visions again, consumed by a burning rage and a thirst for revenge. Ajax took up his great sword. He was going to murder the kings who had dishonored him, Agamemnon, Menelaus, and especially Odysseus in their sleep. But as he crept through the darkened camp, Cassandra saw another figure, a radiant gray-eyed goddess, appear beside him. It was Athena, the patron of Odysseus. With a soft, cruel whisper, the goddess of wisdom cast a spell of madness upon the grieving warrior. The vision became a horrifying spectacle. Cassandra watched as Ajax, his eyes now wild and vacant with insanity, stalked through the camp. But he did not see the tents of the Greek kings. In his divinely scrambled mind, he saw a great flock of the army's sheep and cattle as the assembled Achaean leaders. With a roar of fury, he began a bloody, insane slaughter, hacking and stabbing at the terrified animals. He captured a great horned ram, believing it to be his rival, Odysseus, and dragged it back to his tent to be flogged and tortured. The vision finally released her, leaving Cassandra trembling and sickened in her dark room. The next morning, Trojan scouts returned from the field with baffling news. The Greek camp was in a state of chaos. The fields were littered with the carcasses of slaughtered livestock, and the great warrior Ajax was nowhere to be seen. The Trojans laughed, believing their enemies were finally destroying themselves, but Cassandra knew the final tragic act was yet to play out. Her sight followed Ajax as he awoke in his tent, the madness lifting from his mind like a fever breaking. She saw the moment of horrifying clarity return to his eyes. She saw him look at the dead ram at his feet, at the blood on his hands, and understand what he had done. He had not taken his revenge on his enemies. He had made a fool of himself, slaughtering innocent animals in a fit of divine madness. The shame for a man whose entire identity was built on honor was an agony far worse than any physical wound. It was unbearable. She saw him walk away from the camp, alone, to a secluded spot on the shore by the sea. There, he fixed the hilt of his great sword in the wet sand, its point aimed at his heart. With a final agonizing cry, he threw himself upon it. When the news of Ajax's suicide reached Troy, the city rejoiced once more. Another great Greek champion had fallen, but Cassandra felt no joy, only a profound, chilling pity. She had seen the entire pathetic tragedy, had witnessed the gods themselves manipulating a noble, flawed man to his doom. She understood, more clearly than ever, that this war had long ceased to be about Helen or honor. It was now a cruel and bloody game being played on the chessboard of her home, and both the Trojans and the Greeks were nothing more than expendable pawns. Book 14, The Gift of the Wooden Horse. The dawn of the 10th year of the war broke like any other, with a gray, weary light that promised another day of stalemate and sorrow. But this morning was different. A strange silence emanated from the plains beyond the city walls. The usual sounds of the Achikam camp, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of soldiers, the distant neighing of horses were gone. A lone Trojan scout, sent out at first light, returned to the city at a full gallop, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. "They are gone," he cried, his voice echoing in the silent courtyard. "The ships, the camp, everything, it is empty." At first, the news was met with a cautious, fearful suspicion. It had to be a trick, a clever ruse from the cunning Odysseus. King Priam, with his sons and a host of armed guards, led a procession out of the Scathan gate for the first time in a decade. They moved slowly, warily, across the trampled, scarred earth towards the Greek beachhead. But the scout had spoken the truth. The vast, sprawling encampment that had been a city of enemies for 10 long years was deserted. The black ships, the 1,000 vessels that had been a constant, menacing presence on the horizon, had vanished. All that remained were the smoldering ashes of their campfires, the debris of a hasty departure, and a profound, unbelievable silence. A slow, hesitant cheer rose from the Trojan soldiers. It grew louder, spreading through the ranks as suspicion gave way to a dawning, ecstatic realization. They had won. They had not been conquered. They had endured. The great Achaean army had given up and sailed for home. The siege was over. The Trojans poured out of the city, a river of humanity flooding the abandoned camp, their cautious joy turning into a wild, unrestrained celebration. They walked along the beach where their greatest enemy had lived, marveling at the sheer scale of the force they had held at bay for so long. And then, in the center of the beach, they saw it. It was a thing of awe and terror, a structure so immense it defied belief. A colossal horse, wrought from planks of firwood, stood silent under the morning sun. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its form powerful and majestic, its head held high with a strange, solemn grace. It was so large that its head seemed to scratch the clouds. On its side was a dedication, an inscription to the goddess Athena, offering the effigy as a gift to appease her anger and to ensure a safe voyage back to Greece. A hush fell over the celebrating crowd. They gathered around the magnificent, terrifying object, and a debate immediately began. What was to be done with it? "It is a trick," one of the king's counselors, Thymotes, argued, his voice sharp with suspicion. "It is a hollow thing, filled with hidden soldiers. We must burn it where it stands, or push it into the sea. Blasphemy, another elder cried, his face pale with piety. It is a sacred offering to the goddess Athena. To destroy it would be a terrible sacrilege. It would bring her divine wrath down upon us. We must bring it into our city, place it in her temple, and honor it as a monument to our victory. As the factions argued, their voices rising in a passionate cacophony of fear and pride, Cassandra moved through the crowd. She had come out with the others, her soul a cold, dead knot of dread. She did not need a vision to know that this thing was a lie. Its very presence felt like a scream in the silent landscape of her sight. She pushed her way to the front of the crowd until she stood at the very foot of the colossal structure. She reached out a trembling hand and pressed her palm flat against the warm, resonant wood of its belly. The moment her skin made contact, the world shattered. A vision more violent, more complete, more terrifying than any she had ever experienced crashed into her mind. It was not a sight, but a complete sensory assault. She heard it, the muffled clank of bronze armor on bronze, the strained, sweaty breathing of men packed into a tight space, a low, tense whisper from Odysseus giving a command to be silent. She smelled it, the acrid scent of nervous sweat, the smell of oiled leather and cold metal, the scent of men holding their breath in the suffocating darkness. And she saw it, flashes of the night to come, the great belly of the horse opening like a wound, the dark forms of soldiers sliding down ropes into her sleeping city, the first house set ablaze, the screams of her people. She snatched her hand back as if burned, a strangled cry escaping her lips. She stumbled backwards, her eyes wide with a horror that was no longer a prophecy, but a present, tangible reality. The monster was already here, and her people were arguing about the best way to welcome it inside. Book 15, the final, desperate plea. Cassandra stumbled back from the great wooden horse, the horrifying clarity of her vision searing itself into her mind. The sounds, the smells, the screams of the city's final night were as real to her as the sand beneath her feet. The arguments of the Trojan elders faded into a meaningless buzz. The fate of her home, of everyone she had ever loved, was being decided here, on this beach, based on pride and superstition. She knew, with a certainty that was a physical agony, that this was her last chance. She had to make them see. She ran forward, her arms outstretched, and threw herself between the debating crowd and the horse. "Stop!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, tearing sound that momentarily silenced them all. "Are you all mad? Do you truly believe our enemies, after 10 years of bitter war, would leave us such a magnificent gift?" She turned and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the horse. "This is not an offering. It is a lie. It is a hollow womb, and its belly is filled with armed soldiers and death. I can hear them. I can hear their armor creaking. I can smell their bloodlust on the wind. If you drag this monster through our sacred gates, I swear to you by all the gods that still listen, by tomorrow's dawn, Troy will be nothing but a field of bones and a memory of smoke." Her plea was so passionate, so filled with the pure, unadulterated terror of her vision, that a flicker of doubt crossed the faces of some in the crowd. But the curse held fast. They saw her wild, desperate eyes, her disheveled hair, the frantic gestures of her hands, and they did not see a prophetess speaking a terrible truth. They saw their poor mad princess, her mind finally completely broken by the long years of war. In a fit of desperate frustration, she looked around, her eyes falling on a discarded soldier's spear lying in the sand. She seized it, and with a strength born of pure terror, she ran at the horse and hurled the spear with all her might into its great wooden flank. The spear struck with a deep, hollow, booming sound, and the great structure seemed to shudder. From within, a faint metallic echo, like the clang of a sword against a shield, was heard by those standing closest. For a heartbeat, the Trojans froze, a new fear in their eyes. But at that moment, a new actor stepped onto the stage. A Greek man, his clothes torn, his face a mask of suffering, was dragged forward by some Trojan soldiers who had found him hiding in the reeds. He was Sinon, a spy left behind for this very purpose. With masterful tears and a voice trembling with feigned fear, he told them a brilliant, calculated lie. He was a deserter, he claimed, who had escaped being sacrificed by his own cruel countrymen. The horse, he explained, was indeed an offering to Athena. The reason the Greeks had built it so colossally large was a strategic one. It was deliberately made too big to fit through Troy's gates, so the Trojans could not take it for themselves and steal the goddess's favor. If the horse were to be harmed, he warned, Athena's wrath would fall upon Troy. But if they were to bring it inside their walls, her protection would be theirs forever. His story was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It played perfectly on Trojan pride, their piety, and their triumphant mood. It gave them a logical, flattering reason to believe exactly what they wanted to believe, that they had won, and that this was their ultimate trophy. His clever lies were far more palatable than Cassandra's frantic, terrifying truths. The crowd, eager to dismiss the unsettling sound the spear had made, now turned on her. "She is mad," they shouted. "She has committed sacrilege. She has struck a holy offering." King Priam, his face a mask of shame and anger at his daughter's public blasphemous display, gave the final order, "Take her away." He commanded the guards, his voice booming with a king's authority. "Lock her in the highest room of the palace. I will not have this glorious day of victory spoiled by the ravings of a lunatic." As the guards dragged the struggling, weeping Cassandra away, another terrible omen appeared. Two monstrous sea serpents rose from the waves and slithered onto the beach, making straight for the priest Laocoon, who had also been loudly warning the Trojans against the horse. The serpents coiled around him and his two young sons, crushing them to death in a horrifying spectacle before disappearing back into the sea. The Trojans, in their deluded state, saw this not as a warning, but as a confirmation. Laocoon had been punished by the gods for speaking against the sacred gift. That settled it. The debate was over. With a great triumphant shout, the Trojans attached ropes to the colossal horse. They began the long, arduous task of hauling it towards the city. It was too large for the Scaean gate, so with a terrible symbolic act of self-destruction, they began to tear down a section of their own mighty, unbreachable wall to make way for it. The sun began to set as the great wooden horse was finally settled in the heart of the city. The Trojans, ecstatic and convinced of their divine favor, began a massive city-wide celebration. Wine flowed freely, and songs of victory echoed through the streets. Locked away in her high, dark chamber, Cassandra listened to the sounds of her city joyfully celebrating its own death. Her spirit was finally, completely broken. She had screamed, she had pleaded, she had offered them physical proof, and they had answered by walling her up. There was nothing more she could do. She sat on the cold floor, wrapped her arms around her knees, and waited for the night to fall. Book 16, The City's Final Feast. The great wooden horse stood in the heart of Troy, a silent, monstrous monument to the city's pride and delusion. Having breached their own walls to bring it inside, the Trojans saw its presence not as an act of self-destruction, but as the ultimate symbol of their victory. The war was over, the Greeks were gone, their gods were appeased, and so they began to celebrate. It was a celebration born from 10 years of fear, grief, and deprivation. It was a wild, reckless, and desperate outpouring of relief. Torches were lit in every street, their flames dancing in the gathering twilight. Wine, held back in reserve for a decade, was brought out and flowed like water. The entire city became a single throbbing entity of joyous, drunken revelry. Soldiers and citizens danced together in the streets, hanging garlands of flowers on the legs of the great horse, singing songs that mocked the cowardice of the departed Greeks and praised the resilience of Troy. They had endured. They had won. From the high, barred window of her chamber, Cassandra watched the city give itself over to the feast. The sounds of their celebration, the music, the laughter, the triumphant shouts drifted up to her, not as sounds of joy, but as the final frantic gasps of a dying animal. Every laughing face was a skull in her sight. Every dancing figure was a ghost. She was a physician watching a patient, diagnosed with a fatal illness, gleefully drink a vial of poison, believing it to be the cure. Her frantic, desperate energy had passed. The final rejection on the beach, the sight of the serpents silencing the only other voice of truth, had broken something deep inside her. There was nothing left to fight. Her role as a prophetess was over. Now, all that remained was the role of a witness. A cold, dreadful calm settled over her, the quiet resignation of one who is simply waiting for the inevitable. She did not weep, she did not scream, she just watched. She watched the sun, her patron god's own chariot, set for the final time on a living Troy, its last rays painting the sky in shades of blood red and funeral purple. She watched the moon rise, pale and indifferent. She watched the constellations trace their familiar paths across the sky, and she watched the city below slowly, finally drink itself into a stupor. The celebrations, which had raged for hours, began to wind down. The songs grew slurred and faded away. The dancers, exhausted from emotion and wine, stumbled home to their beds. The watchmen on the newly broken walls, who should have been at their most alert, had joined the celebration and now slept heavily at their posts. A deep, drunken, and utterly defenseless slumber fell over the entire city. The streets, so recently filled with noise, grew quiet. By the dead of night, the only sound was the gentle whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a seabird. It was the perfect, peaceful silence of a city moments away from its own annihilation. Cassandra, still awake, still watching, leaned against the cold stone of her window. Her senses, sharpened by the sight, were stretched to their breaking point. And then she saw it. On the highest point of the Trojan citadel, a single shielded torch was uncovered for a moment, flashing a signal out towards the dark, empty sea. It was Sinon, the spy, calling the fleet back from its hiding place behind the island of Tenedos. A few moments later, from the great dark belly of the wooden horse that stood silent in the square below her, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a faint yet distinct metallic scrape, the sound of a bolt being carefully, quietly drawn. Then a low, deep groan of wood on wood. A door was opening. The end had begun. Book 17, The Night the Stars Fell. The sound from the horse was followed by a length of thick rope, snaking its way down the colossal leg to the ground. Then a dark figure began to descend, moving with the silent, deadly grace of a panther. It was Odysseus. He was followed by another and another, the elite killers of the Achaean army, the men who had been hidden for long, suffocating hours in the dark, waiting for this moment. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, their bronze armor painted black to blend with the night. The first to die were the sleeping Trojan guards, who had been celebrating at the foot of the horse. They were dispatched without a sound, their throats cut before they could even register the waking nightmare. Then the Greek warriors fanned out, Odysseus directing them with hand signals. Some ran to silence the watchmen on the walls, others ran to the great Skyan gate, killing the sentries and throwing open the heavy doors to the city. Cassandra watched from her window, a silent, helpless spectator, to a horror she had foreseen in perfect detail. She saw the main Greek army, which had sailed back under the cover of darkness, now flooding into the city. There was no battle, it was a slaughter. The Trojans, roused from their drunken sleep by the first screams, were confused and disoriented. They stumbled out of their homes, unarmed, and were cut down in the doorways. The night air, so recently filled with songs of victory, was now filled with the screams of the dying, the brutal clash of swords, and the roar of a new and terrible sound. Fire. The Greeks, with a cold, systematic fury, began to torch the city, house by house. The beautiful, proud city of Troy, her home, was becoming a sea of flame. From her high vantage point, she saw it all, every small personal tragedy magnified by her foreknowledge. She saw the baker, a kind man who had always given her a warm smile, cut down as he tried to defend his family. She saw the house of a childhood friend, a place where she had spent many happy afternoons, consumed by a great gout of fire. It was the literal horrifying manifestation of her life's work, the ultimate, agonizing "I told you so," and there was no vindication in it, only a soul-shattering agony. The fighting, a chaotic, one-sided massacre, finally reached the palace. Cassandra could hear the screams and the clash of bronze from within the walls of her own home. The last of the Trojan warriors, her brothers and cousins, made a final desperate stand on the great staircase, but they were overwhelmed and cut down. She had a final searing vision of her father, the old and noble King Priam, dragging himself to the altar of Zeus in the central courtyard, seeking sanctuary. And she saw the brutal son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, his face a mask of pitiless rage, follow him there and slay the old king in the very heart of his home, a final act of sacrilege. She saw the women of Troy, her mother Queen Hecuba, her beloved sister-in-law Andromache, and all the others, herded into the courtyard like cattle, their royal robes torn and stained with soot. Their grief was a raw, fresh, screaming thing. Cassandra's grief was ancient and weary. Then she heard the heavy, splintering crash of her own chamber door being smashed open. Two Greek soldiers burst in, their faces illuminated by the fires from outside, their eyes filled with a conqueror's lust and greed. Behind them stood their commander, Ajax the Lesser, a cruel and arrogant man. Cassandra did not scream. She ran, not to the window, but to a small private shrine to Athena that stood in the corner of her room. She threw her arms around the cool, smooth wood of the goddess's statue, clinging to it as a drowning sailor clings to a piece of wreckage. She had been a priestess of Apollo, but it was Athena, the protector of cities, to whom she made her final, hopeless plea for sanctuary. There was no divine intervention. There was no miracle. Ajax strode forward and grabbed her by the hair, his grip like iron. He tore her away from the statue, her fingers scraping against the wood, and dragged her from the room. The sacred statue, pulled off balance, toppled to the floor with a hollow crash. He dragged her out of the burning palace, a captive, a prize of war. The city she had fought so desperately to save was now an inferno, a roaring, screaming testament to her failure. As she was pulled through the chaotic streets, she looked up at the sky, but the familiar, comforting patterns of the stars were gone, completely blotted out by the thick, choking black smoke that rose from her dying home. The night the stars fell was not a metaphor. For Troy, the very heavens had been erased. Book 15, A Prize of War. The dawn that broke over the ruins of Troy was a thing of cruel, indifferent beauty. The rising sun cast a soft, rosy light upon a scene of utter devastation. What had once been a proud, gleaming city was now a skeletal ruin of blackened stone and smoldering timbers. The air, once filled with the scent of sea salt and baking bread, was now thick with the cloying metallic smell of blood and the bitter stench of ash. The silence of the dead had replaced the songs of the living. On the beach below the ruined city, the survivors, the women, the children, the few old men who had not been slain, were herded together like livestock. They were the spoils of war. Cassandra stood among them, a strange, still figure in the midst of the raw, keening grief. She watched as her mother, Hecuba, the once proud queen, collapsed to the ground, her royal dignity shattered, her wails mixing with those of the other captive women. She saw her sister-in-law, Andromache, the noble wife of Hector, clutching her small son, Astyanax, to her chest, her face a mask of pure animal terror. A new, terrible vision seized Cassandra, sharp and immediate. She saw the Greek commanders, Odysseus among them, their faces hard and pragmatic. She heard their debate. As long as a male heir of Hector lived, Troy could one day rise again. She saw their verdict. A moment later, two soldiers approached Andromache and, ignoring her desperate screams, pried the child from her arms. Cassandra did not need to watch the rest. She closed her eyes, but she could still see the image from her sight, the small body of her nephew being carried to the top of the city's broken walls and thrown from them, a final brutal sacrifice to the Greeks' fear of future vengeance. This was the new order, a world without mercy. Later that day, the division of the prizes began. The Greek kings, their armor still stained with the blood of her family, stood together and portioned out the treasures of Troy. Piles of gold, silver, and precious armor were divided. And then it was the turn of the women. One by one, they were claimed, their futures decided by the men who had murdered their husbands and sons. Hecuba was given to Odysseus, Andromache to Neoptolemus, the man who had killed Priam. Then they came for Cassandra, Ajax the Lesser, the man who had dragged her from Athena's temple, made his claim, arguing that she was his by right of capture. But the other kings, fearing the wrath of the goddess whose sanctuary he had so violently profaned, roared him down. A furious debate erupted, and Ajax was nearly stoned by his own men for the sacrilege. To save himself, he swore a false oath that he had not harmed the princess. He was spared, but his claim was denied. From the back of the assembly, the great king Agamemnon, the commander of all the Achaean forces, stepped forward. As the leader, he had the right to the finest prize, and in his eyes, the strange, beautiful, and mad prophetess of Troy was the most exotic and valuable prize of all. "She will be mine," he declared, his voice booming with the arrogance of a man who had just conquered the world. He strode towards her, a giant of a man in gleaming bronze, his face flushed with victory. He looked down at Cassandra, expecting to see fear or submission. Instead, he saw a pair of dark, empty eyes that looked at him not as a conqueror, but as if he were already a corpse. As his hand closed around her arm to claim her, the final great vision of her life flooded her mind. It was not of Troy, it was of a different land, a grim stone fortress in a place called Mycenae. She saw a palace shrouded in an ancient familial curse. She saw a woman with a face as hard as an axe, her heart full of a simmering murderous rage, Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra. She saw a net, a bathtub filled with steaming blood-red water, and a great bronze axe rising and falling, and she saw two bodies shrouded for burial. One was the great king, who now held her arm. The other was her own. She now knew. She had survived the fall of her city, only to be a sacrificial lamb in the bloody drama of another man's doomed house. She let out a single, low laugh, a sound so devoid of mirth, so full of bitter, terrible irony, that it made Agamemnon flinch. He saw only madness. He had no way of knowing that she was laughing at the perfect, poetic cruelty of the gods. He, the great conqueror, was leading her to her death, utterly unaware that he was walking hand in hand with her to his own. Book 19, The Voyage to Mycenae, the voyage home across the wine-dark sea, was, for the Greeks, a long, triumphant celebration. Their black ships were heavy with the plundered treasures of Troy, their sails full with a wind that seemed to applaud their victory. The soldiers spent the days and nights drinking, singing heroic songs of their own exploits, and celebrating the end of a long and brutal war. They were going home, to their wives, their children, their kingdoms. They were victors. For Cassandra, The voyage was a funeral procession. She was a captive, a slave, but as the king's personal prize, she was given a strange, isolated honor. She was kept in Agamemnon's own cabin, a gilded cage on a ship of ghosts. The sounds of the celebrating soldiers were a dull, meaningless roar to her. The sounds she heard were those of the future. The creak of the ship's timbers sounded like the groan of a palace door opening for an assassin. The cry of a seabird was the shriek of a dying king. The endless rhythmic slap of the waves against the hull was the sound of an axe, rising and falling, rising and falling. Agamemnon, in the peak of his hubris, was fascinated by her. He would come to his cabin and find her staring out at the endless expanse of water, her eyes seeing something far beyond the horizon. He was a proud man, a king of kings, and he could not stand her silent indifference. He tried to speak with her, to draw her out of her strange, silent madness. "You are a prophetess," they say. He would boom, his voice full of the easy confidence of a victor. "Tell me, what do you see in my future?" "Great glory, no doubt. More kingdoms to conquer? A long and peaceful reign in my great palace at Mycenae?" Cassandra would turn her head slowly from the sea and look at him, her dark eyes holding no fear, only a chilling, empty pity. "I see a palace," she would whisper, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "But it is not a house of glory, it is a house of slaughter. I see a welcome, but the carpet they roll for you is red with the blood of your own kin." He would laugh, a great booming sound. "You Trojans are a dramatic people. It is the trauma of war that makes you speak in such dark riddles." "I see a wife who awaits you," she continued, her voice never changing its flat, eerie tone. "But she does not wait with a loving heart. She waits with a net of death. She is a lioness who has taken a wolf to her bed while the lion was away at war, and she waits for the lion to return, not to welcome him, but to slaughter him. Enough of your mad ravings," he would command, his amusement beginning to sour into irritation. Her words were nonsense. Of course, the babbling of a broken mind, but there was a cold certainty in her gaze that was deeply unsettling. He found himself preferring her silence to her speech. Her visions grew more intense as they drew closer to Greece. The voyage became a waking nightmare. She was no longer just seeing flashes of the future, she was living in it. She would sit for hours unmoving, her eyes wide, whispering to the ghosts of the house of Atreus, the cursed family she was about to join in death. She saw the curse born from the sins of their fathers, a chain of betrayal and murder that stretched back for generations. She saw not only Agamemnon's murder, but her own and the terrible matricide that would follow when his son Orestes returned to avenge him. She saw the Furies, the ancient black-winged goddesses of vengeance, already gathering on the horizon, drawn by the stench of the bloodshed to come. One night, a great storm fell upon the fleet, a sudden violent tempest that seemed to come from nowhere. The sky turned black, the sea rose in mountainous waves, and the ships were tossed about like toys. The Greek sailors, seasoned veterans of the sea, were terrified, praying to Poseidon for mercy. But Cassandra sat perfectly still in the swaying cabin, a strange calm on her face. She had seen the storm coming. She knew it was the anger of the gods at their sacrilege in Troy. She also knew that this ship, Agamemnon's ship, would survive. The fates were not finished with him yet. He had an appointment to keep in a blood-soaked bathtub. When the storm finally passed, and the morning dawned clear and calm, Agamemnon looked at her with a new sense of awe and suspicion. Her calm during the tempest seemed to him a sign of her strange, otherworldly power. He began to see her less as a madwoman and more as a dark and mysterious talisman, a symbol of his victory over a magical, cursed city. The irony was lost on him. Then, one afternoon, the cry came from the lookout. "Land, land ahead." The soldiers rushed to the decks, their cheers echoing across the water. It was Greece. They were home. Agamemnon stood at the prow of his ship, a proud and triumphant king, his great palace of Mycenae visible on a distant hill. He was the conqueror of Troy, returning to his adoring people and his faithful wife. Cassandra stood silently beside him. She looked at the approaching shore, at the grim stone walls of the fortress on the hill. She saw the crowds gathering at the harbor to welcome their king. But in her sight, the cheering people were a chorus of mourners. The great lion gate of the palace was the mouth of a tomb, and the rich crimson carpet they were unrolling for their victorious king was not a path of honor, but a river of blood flowing down to the sea to meet them. Book Dex, The Unbelieved End. The great ship of Agamemnon glided into the harbor of Mycenae, its journey complete. To the cheering crowds gathered on the shore, it was a symbol of glorious victory, the vessel that carried their conquering king home. To Cassandra, it was a coffin, and it had just arrived at the graveyard. As she was led onto the docks, the sounds of the celebration were a dull, meaningless roar in her ears. She looked up at the grim, imposing fortress of the Atreides, at the famous lion gate that stood as its entrance, and her sight showed her not a welcoming palace, but a house built on a foundation of curses, its stones saturated with the blood of murdered kin. A royal delegation came to greet them, led by a figure of regal and terrifying composure. It was Queen Clytemnestra. She was beautiful, but her beauty was that of a polished axe blade, all hard lines and cold fury. She moved with a practiced grace, her face a perfect mask of wifely devotion, as she welcomed her long-absent husband. She gave a grand, eloquent speech, her voice ringing with false joy, speaking of the 10 long years she had waited, her loom her only companion, her loyalty unwavering. Cassandra stood behind Agamemnon and listened, and in her mind she could hear the truth beneath the words, the seething hatred, the years of festering resentment for the daughter Iphigenia, whom Agamemnon had sacrificed for a fair win to Troy, and the burning passion for her new lover Aegisthus, with whom she now ruled this house. Let the path for my conquering lord be worthy of his triumph, Clytemnestra commanded. Her handmaidens rushed forward and began to unroll a magnificent tapestry, a cloth of the deepest, richest crimson, so vibrant it looked like a river of fresh blood flowing from the palace doors down to the king's chariot. Let no foot but his touch this sacred path. Agamemnon hesitated. To walk upon such a rich and sacred cloth was an act of profound hubris, an honor reserved for the gods alone. To do so was to invite divine envy and punishment, he argued, his piety clashing with his pride. But Clytemnestra was a master of persuasion. She gently, skillfully mocked his fear, flattered his victory, and questioned if he was truly the conqueror of Troy, if he was afraid to walk upon a simple cloth. His pride won. He stepped from his chariot and with a conqueror's stride walked the crimson path into his home. Cassandra watched him go, and she saw him not as a king entering his palace, but as a sacrificial bull walking willingly into the slaughterhouse. You, Clytemnestra said, turning to Cassandra with a cold, dismissive look, come, you are a slave of this house now. But Cassandra did not move. She remained standing by the chariot, her feet refusing to cross the threshold of the lion gate. A great final prophetic fit seized her, the culmination of a lifetime of unheard warnings. She was no longer speaking in riddles. She was a clear, terrifying window into the heart of reality. She threw her head back and screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that silenced the entire courtyard. This house, she cried, pointing a trembling finger at the palace. It stinks. It reeks of the charnel house, of the blood of slaughtered children. I see the ghosts of a feast where a father was served the flesh of his own sons. This is a house the gods have cursed. The chorus of Mycenaean elders, who had gathered to welcome their king, stared at her, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They knew the dark old stories of their king's family, and her words struck a deep, unsettling chord. And now a new sacrifice is prepared, she continued, her eyes wide, staring at the closed palace doors, as if they were made of glass. I see a bath of blood. I see a net, a web of cloth that will entangle the great bull. I see an axe wielded by a lioness. She will strike him down as he bathes. Helpless, your king is being murdered. Her vision then turned inward, and a look of profound, quiet sorrow replaced the frantic terror. And she will not be satisfied with one death, she whispered, her voice now filled with a strange, calm resignation. Another victim awaits, a stranger from a fallen city, a wild swan who will die alongside the eagle. I see my own end. This is the final shore of my long and wretched journey. Her frenzy passed, leaving her calm, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had spoken the absolute truth. She had laid bare the past, the present, and the immediate future for all to see. The curse, however, remained absolute. The elders looked at her, at this strange, raving, foreign woman, and while her words chilled them to the bone, they could not bring themselves to believe. They could not accept that their queen was a murderer and that their victorious king was already dead. They saw only a mad woman, her mind shattered by the horrors she had witnessed. Cassandra looked at their confused, pitying faces, and she understood. Her work was done. Her life's purpose, to be the unheard prophetess of doom, was complete. There was no more to say. There is no escape from what is fated, she said, her voice now quiet and clear. One can only choose how to meet it. With a strange, regal dignity that none had ever seen in her before, she took a deep breath, and with her head held high, she walked alone through the great lion gate and into the house of death to keep the appointment her sight had promised her. The chorus of elders remained outside, paralyzed by dread and uncertainty. A long, terrible moment of silence passed, and then, from deep within the palace, a single horrifying, muffled scream of agony was heard. Agamemnon's. It was followed by another. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The truth had been told, and it had not been believed, not until the very end. The life of Cassandra, the princess who saw all and was heard by none, was over. Her final legacy was not the warning she had given, but the terrible, echoing silence that followed when the screams had faded, and her voice was finally and forever extinguished.